Thank you very much, Emily. I'm very pleased to be here. It is impromptu. I gave a talk yesterday in the economics department about our current depression, and Emily heard it and thought some of the things I said would be interesting. And I enjoyed listening to the two talks just before lunch, and reading the summaries in the pamphlet, both of the talks and of the articles at the end. So I'm very interested in decision making, and I'm going to talk mainly about the Depression, but I want to say something first about judicial decision making, because some of the things that Professor Margle said made me think about this. I published a book last year called How Judges Think. That was my polite title. Alternatives I played with were Do Judges Think? Which judges think? And one of the things I stress in the book is that there's a great deal of uncertainty in the American legal system, especially as one proceeds up the ladder from trial courts to appellate courts and up to the Supreme Courts, including, of course, the U.S. Supreme Court. And the point I stress is that as you go up, the ability to decide cases simply by comparing the issue you have with some authoritative text, statute, a constitutional provision, or a judicial decision wanes, and judges have much more discretion. They're in what I call an open area. And then the fascinating question is, how do people decide issues when they are in this open area, when what Professor Margle called algorithmic thinking, algorithmic analysis, is no longer available? And the answer is people called upon to make a decision will make a decision even if they do not have the materials to use logical methods to arrive at a decision which everyone will agree is correct. And among the preconceptions which will shape decisions when you don't have good logical methods or good empirical methods of making a judgment is a political ideology. That's very important for judges. And what I try to, or a main focus of the book is trying to explain what influences a person's choice of ideology, which in turn will influence judicial decisions in the open area. I discuss things such as temperament, which I think are important. There's an old literature recently revived by Adorno and Allport about the authoritarian personality. And I think there's a lot to it. There are people, for example, judges, for example, who really like rules a great deal. They like authority, the notion that decisions are rendered in accordance with hierarchical, authoritative structures. Then there are other judges who are looser about that, less authoritarian, less comfortable with rules than with standards. I think also life experience has a big influence on how people react to cases. They fit a new case to a personal experience they've had. And those experiences, in turn, they can both shape your reaction to a case directly and can shape your ideology, which in turn will influence decision. So I just mentioned that as an example of my agreement that there's a lot more to decision-making and to thinking generally than what can be formalized. And I understand, since economics is a formal discipline, that you can be uncomfortable with some of its methods and, of course, its results. But I also think that your criticisms or your concerns about economics properly apply to not only to social science generally, but to modernity generally. So if you've read Max Weber, you know that his great idea, which has been vindicated by time, it's more than a century, it's a century since his major works, is that the course of modernity is bringing more and more human activities under the rule of rationality. And by rationality, he meant simply systematic thinking. I don't think he would confine it to algorithmic processes, but systematizing, specializing, careful study, and with a view toward shaping the environment, the social, political, and natural environment. And when Professor Shore was talking about our consumer society, it is not so much economics, certainly economic thinking, that shapes the a great interest of Americans in accumulating goods and services. It's scientific marketing. Advertisers, packagers, sellers, producers know much more about how you can influence people's consumption decisions than was known 100 years ago. So modernity brings in its train the problems that concern you. Modernity also will help you to solve those problems. Whatever you think of the ideology of economics or the ideology that many economists hold, there's no way in which you can deal with any of the problems you discuss, such as global warming, such as biodiversity depletion, such as overpopulation, without economics, because nobody is going to embrace projects of reform in these areas without considering the costs, without considering the incentive effects, without considering how people will try to nullify any measures, and without consideration of all the secondary effects which policy changes bring in. And we won't be able to do this without property rights. So one of the points that economists have made, along with many others, is that often problems of environmental degradation are problems that arise from absence of property rights. And a standard example is overfishing. You get overfishing because nobody owns the fishing beds. So you might as well, as a businessman, take the fish as fast as you can because you can't sort of reserve them for harvesting on a basis that enables them to reproduce. And similarly with, one of the successes of environmental regulation is the cap and trade system for sulfur dioxide for acid rain, which has reduced the amount of sulfur dioxide produced by business at minimum cost, and that's what one of the plans of the Obama administration for global warming is try to have such a program for carbon emissions. But the main thing I wanted to discuss is the Depression, and with reference to the Greenspan quotation that you feature in your pamphlet under the heading of free market mindset. I'm not an admirer of Alan Greenspan, and I don't agree with the quotation. So what he says, you've all read this, he says, I made a mistake in presuming that the self-interest of organizations, specifically banks, were such as they were best capable of protecting their own shareholders and their equity in the firm. I found a flaw in the model that I perceived as the critical functioning structure that defines how the world